Good evening and Merry Christmas. Pastor Joel here with your Christmas Eve devotion from Luke chapter 1 verse 37. I'd like to begin this brief devotion with a question. Have you ever faced an impossibility? I mean, something so difficult you had no idea how or where you were going to begin. In fact, maybe you're facing an impossibility right now with your finances or a job or a relationship, or maybe you're in a new season of life that seems so overwhelming to you that you have no idea how or where you're going to begin. Well, whatever your situation, I think that the Christmas story can become a source of hope and encouragement to us as we face these seemingly impossible situations in our life. If we look at the character of Mary, for instance, I'm sure she could identify with some of the impossibilities we might be facing today. I know this because the Christmas story gives us at least 3 reasons why impossibilities can become possibilities for God. Number 1, I think God does extraordinary things through ordinary people. When we look at Mary, for instance, we see that she was a very unlikely candidate for anything great. Why? Because she was young, she was not rich, she was not highly educated, her family was not a power player in society, and then as a female living in the first century, Mary was unlikely to do anything extraordinary in her life. In fact, with the exception of childbearing, the first century world overlooked women entirely, and they treated them as property. And so to the people of Mary's day, Mary would have seemed very unusable by God for any major task in her life. So let me ask you this. Do you feel ordinary or average or run-of-the-mill, or that there's nothing exceptional about you or what you have to offer? You know, if the answer is yes, then that's good, because you're exactly the type of person God is looking for. God uses ordinary people, just like you and me, to accomplish His extraordinary purposes. God may call you to take care of a special child. He may ask you to reach out to a neighbor who's hurting. He might invite you to be a friend to a lonely life. You never know where those things are going to lead, because in God's economy, extraordinary things happen when ordinary people act in obedience. And this really leads me to my second point this evening, which is obedience. Obedience opens the door for God's extraordinary work. You know, the Bible doesn't tell us that Mary was an extraordinary individual, but she did have something that caught God's attention, and that was obedience. Mary's, I think it was her humility coupled with her obedience that set her apart from the rest of the group. And that was enough for God to choose her for one of the most important roles in human history. Isn't that incredible? Obedience, that's what it took. And you might feel that your lack of education, your limited finances, or your shortage of experience, that somehow disqualifies you from God's service. But you got to hear me, that's not true at all. We should never limit God by looking at ourselves. God's not limited by what we have or don't have. God doesn't call the qualified, He qualifies the called. And everyone is called by God to do something, and He can use anyone, just as long as we are willing to trust Him and obey. Mary didn't understand how God's plan was going to unfold in her life, but she trusted God enough when she heard the message from the angel. Don't be afraid, Mary. You have found favor with God. You will conceive and give birth to a son, and you are to call him Jesus. And this leads me to my third point this evening. Doing extraordinary things for God doesn't equate to becoming famous. You know, I think we tend to think of fame and success in terms of how our culture packages it. Money, popularity, appearances on TV shows, a massive social media following, and this kind of stuff. But God's call doesn't automatically bring instant success or fame to our life. In fact, sometimes God's call on our life may cause pain, ridicule, and rejection. In Mary's case, the call of God hurt her reputation, Her fiancé almost left her, and her community ostracized her. Yet through it all, Mary's obedience and her submission to God's call on her life led to the incarnation of God's Son, and the final stages of the plan of salvation was set. Wow. Listen, in conclusion here this evening, the most extraordinary event in history happened in the most unlikely of places and the most unlikely of ways among the most unlikely of people, right? Why? Because impossibilities are God's specialty. Whatever impossibility you're facing today, remember that at the heart of the Christmas story is this: what is impossible for man is possible for God. Luke 18:27. You know, through the birth of Jesus, the good news of the gospel was released, and today it reaches the ends of the earth, including plain, ordinary people like you and me. Jesus comes to anyone and everyone with a humble and obedient heart. So whoever you are, whatever you do, you can receive the extraordinary gift of eternal life through Jesus. It may sound impossible and even outrageous, but remember, impossible is nothing for God, right? And if you think that salvation is this far-fetched idea, you got to remember the words of Jim Elliot, the missionary. He said, "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose." You know, after we reach the end of our days, we're each left facing the enormity of eternity, and no amount of money, no good deed, no human accomplishment can secure our salvation or rescue us. Left alone to our own devices, our salvation is the greatest impossibility that we face. But through the impossibility of the incarnation, God made the impossible possible. He provided Jesus and made a way for us to gain what we cannot lose. That is amazing. Merry Christmas to you and your family this Christmas season.